There is a moment when a man realizes the life he thought he was building was never truly his to begin with. Not the house, not the accounts, not the future that had been quietly, methodically dismantled while he was still showing up to work every morning, still kissing a woman on the cheek before she left for her Pilates class, still believing that the tension in his marriage was temporary, the kind of friction that every long-term couple eventually works through. That moment of realization, cold, precise, arriving without ceremony, came for Marcus Webb on a Tuesday morning in March, when he walked into his home office and found that his desk had been emptied. His filing cabinet stood open and bare, and the framed architectural rendering of his first major project, the one he had hung on that wall for 11 years, was simply gone. He didn't panic. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Marcus Webb. He stood in the doorway of that empty office, took a long breath, and began to think. Because that was always Marcus's way. The thinking, the quiet, methodical working through of a problem until its shape became clear. It was the quality that had made him one of the most sought-after structural engineers in the region before he was 40. It was the quality that had made him, in the eyes of his wife Renata, seem passive, unambitious, unworthy of the life she believed she deserved. She had blocked his number before he even reached his phone to call her. All three of them. His cell, his office line, and the landline. They still kept for reasons neither of them had ever properly explained. She had taken her time. She had planned this with the same careful attention to detail that Marcus had always admired in her back when that detail was directed towards something they shared, and now she had directed it entirely toward taking apart his world. Before this story is finished, you will see what planning truly looks like, and you will understand why, 8 months later, a television screen in a home Marcus Webb, no longer legally owned, would display his face, and a woman who had blocked him on every conceivable platform would call him 44 times in a single evening. If you appreciate stories about patience, about dignity, and about the kind of quiet justice that never announces itself until the moment it is absolutely unavoidable, drop a like before we go further, and if you are new here, welcome. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Now, let us go back to where it truly began. Marcus and Renata Webb had been married for 9 years when she left. They had met at a professional conference in Atlanta, where Marcus had delivered a presentation on load-bearing innovation in high-rise residential development, and Renata had been attending on behalf of the interior design firm where she was then a junior associate. She was striking, confident, fluent in the language of aesthetics, in a way that Marcus, who lived primarily in the language of numbers and structure, had found genuinely dazzling. They dated for 2 years, moved in together, married, and settled into a 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Charlotte that Marcus had purchased outright using a combination of savings and a performance bonus from his engineering firm. The house was in his name. This fact would become significant. But at the time of their marriage, it was simply a practical reality. Marcus had the capital, Marcus handled the finances, and Renata was building her career with a newer interior design studio she had co-founded with a colleague named Diane Forsyth. The studio was called Forsyth Web Design, and in the early years of the marriage, it was modestly successful. Renata earned a comfortable income, not as substantial as Marcus's, but respectable. She was good at what she did. She understood spaces, understood how rooms could make people feel things they did not expect to feel. What Marcus did not fully understand for longer than he should have was how profoundly his financial stability had become a source of resentment for Renata rather than a foundation for their shared life. She had begun, somewhere around year 4 or 5 of the marriage, to reframe his success, not as something they shared, but as something that diminished her. He earned more. He was recognized more widely in professional circles. When they attended events together, people sometimes asked him questions and then waited politely while Renata spoke, rather than the other way around. She had noticed this. She had cataloged it. And rather than address it openly, She had begun quietly redirecting resources. It started with the joint account. Marcus noticed, around 18 months before the Tuesday morning in March, that the balance seemed lower than it should be given their household income. He raised it once, gently, over dinner. Renata explained that she had been reinvesting in the studio, covering some operational costs, while a larger project's payment was pending. Marcus had accepted this. He was, at his core, a man who defaulted to trust in the people he loved. This was not naivety. He had simply never encountered in his personal life the kind of calculated betrayal he was now swimming in. Over the following months, the account was gradually drained. Transfers to an account he was not on. Credit cards in her name run to their limits on business expenses that were never actually business expenses. The studio had in fact been struggling. Diane Forsyth had quietly bought out Renata's stake 8 months prior to the March morning, a transaction that had generated a lump sum payment that Marcus never saw, because it had gone directly into an account he did not know existed. His wife had been preparing her exit for the better part of 2 years, and she had been thorough. She had also, it would turn out, made several significant errors, not immediately obvious errors. Not the kind of errors that announce themselves, the kind that sit quietly in documents and account records, waiting for someone methodical and intelligent enough to find them. Marcus did not spend the first days after she left in grief. He spent them in reconstruction. He sat at the kitchen table, his kitchen table, in his house, the one he had purchased and paid the mortgage on for 9 years, with a yellow legal pad, and began writing down everything he knew. Every account, every asset, every professional relationship that had intersected with their finances. He was not angry, precisely. He was focused. There is a difference, and it matters enormously in what followed. His attorney, a woman named Carol Lindugua, who had been recommended by a colleague, and who Marcus would later describe as the single most important phone call he made in his life, met with him within 72 hours. Carol was sharp, methodical, and possessed of a particular quality that Marcus immediately recognized and valued. She did not rush. She listened to the full picture before she spoke. And when she did speak, she said 5 words that Marcus would carry with him through everything that followed. Let her think she won. Carol explained the situation with clinical precision. The house was Marcus's premarital asset, purchased before the marriage, with documented personal funds. Renata had no legal claim to it, regardless of how long they had lived there together. The joint account had been improperly drained, and the transfer records would constitute evidence of financial misconduct in a divorce proceeding. The undisclosed account, funded by the Forsyth buyout, was a marital asset that had been deliberately concealed, which was a discovery violation that would matter significantly once litigation began. And the debt Renata had accumulated on shared credit instruments, debt she had incurred and which she had apparently assumed Marcus would be liable for, was, in Carol's assessment, about to become Renata's problem in ways she had not anticipated. "She has taken your money," Carol said. "She has not taken your position. Those are very different things." Marcus filed for divorce within the week. He did not contact Renata. He did not attempt to reach her through intermediaries. He allowed Carol to manage all formal communications, and he returned to his work, to his projects, to the daily architecture of a life he was quietly and deliberately rebuilding. He moved through those first weeks with a stillness that some of his colleagues found unsettling. His assistant once asked him, carefully, if he was all right. Marcus had looked up from his drafting table and said, "I'm working," and that was, in its way, a complete answer. The divorce proceedings were not simple. Renata had her own attorney, a man named Jeffrey Carver, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics, and who had apparently advised her that her best strategy was to attack Marcus's character and professional conduct as a means of establishing grounds for a larger settlement. He filed motions alleging financial control and emotional abuse. He submitted affidavits from 2 of Renata's friends claiming that Marcus had been domineering and withholding during the marriage. He attempted to argue that the family home, the one Marcus had purchased before the marriage with his own documented funds, should be subject to equitable distribution based on Renata's claimed contributions to its maintenance and improvement. Carol dismantled each of these arguments with the quiet efficiency of someone who has never needed to raise her voice. The purchase records for the house were clean and unambiguous. The claims of emotional abuse were speculative and unsupported by any contemporaneous documentation. And the financial misconduct evidence, the transfer records, the hidden account, the undisclosed buyout payment, was documented in bank records that Carol had obtained through the formal discovery process in a way that made Renata's legal position substantially worse with each submission. It was during discovery that the full scope of Renata's preparations became visible. She had, over the course of approximately 26 months, transferred approximately $84,000 from the joint account into the undisclosed personal account. The Forsyth buyout had added another $61,000. She had also, apparently with some assistance from someone in her professional network, leased a two-bedroom apartment in an upscale building downtown under a company name associated with her design work, with the lease payments being made from the joint account for 14 months before Marcus had been aware of its existence. She had been preparing a parallel life, and she had been funding it with money that legally belonged to both of them. When these figures were presented in the formal proceeding, Marcus did not look at Renata. He looked at the documents. He was not interested in her reaction in that moment. He was interested in the numbers, in the way a man who has spent his career making sure structures are sound is always interested first in the integrity of the foundation. The court took a dim view of the concealed transfers. The judge, a methodical man named Honorable David Eze, who had been on the family court bench for 19 years and who was not easily impressed by theatrical arguments, noted in his preliminary observations that the documented financial conduct raised significant questions about good faith on Renata's part throughout the marriage. My proceedings themselves. Jeffrey Carver's aggressive posture shifted perceptibly after that session. He began proposing settlements. This is where Marcus, guided by Carol, demonstrated the patience that would ultimately define the entire outcome. He did not rush to settle. He did not accept the first offer, which would have given Renata a portion of the equity in the house and a reduction of her liability for the transferred funds. He did not accept the second offer either, which was marginally better for him, but still left ambiguities he was not willing to live with. He waited. He continued building his professional practice. He accepted a major contract, a commercial mixed-use development in the Research Triangle that would become one of the largest projects of his career, and he let the legal process proceed at its own deliberate pace. During these months, he heard about Renata, occasionally through mutual acquaintances. He did not seek out this information, but neither did he refuse it when it arrived. He learned that she had moved in with someone, a man named Trevor, who was involved in commercial real estate and who had, by several accounts, a lifestyle considerably more expensive than his documented income would suggest. He learned that the downtown apartment, the one she had leased with joint funds, had been given up, apparently because the new arrangement with Trevor was more comfortable. He learned that Forsyth Web Design had, after Renata's departure, rebranded as simply Forsyth Design, and that Diane Forsyth had publicly credited the studio's improved trajectory to a fresh creative direction, which was, in the world of small professional communities, a fairly legible commentary on the previous dynamic. Marcus noted all of this in the way a structural engineer notes the behavior of a building under stress. Not with satisfaction, not yet, but with the calm attention of someone who understands that forces in motion tend to reveal, over time, exactly where the weaknesses were. The final divorce settlement was reached 7 months after filing, approved by Judge Ease on a Wednesday afternoon in October. The terms were, by any reasonable measure, a complete reversal of what Renata had apparently anticipated when she drained the accounts and blocked every number. The house remained Marcus's in full, as it always legally had been. Renata was held liable for the repayment of $67,000 of the transferred funds, with a structured repayment plan attached to the order. The hidden account balance, which had, over the months of proceedings, been partially spent, reducing the available funds, was to be divided proportionally, with appropriate adjustments for the misconduct finding. The debt on the shared credit instruments was assigned to Renata entirely, given the evidence that the expenditures were made unilaterally and without Marcus's knowledge or consent. Marcus walked out of that courthouse into a clear October afternoon with Carol at his side, and he stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, looking at the street. "How do you feel?" Carol asked. "Like I know where the building stands," Marcus said. She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard his own laughter in what felt like a very long time. He returned to his work. He returned to his house, which he had maintained throughout the proceedings, with the same steady care he brought to everything. He repainted the office, where his desk had stood empty. He rehung the architectural rendering. He had found it, as it happened at Renata's mother's house, where a mutual acquaintance had spotted it during a visit and mentioned it to Marcus with considerable awkwardness. Through Carol, he had had it returned. It went back on the same wall, at the same height, as if it had never been moved. Because some things, Marcus believed, should simply be where they belong. The months that followed were by outward appearance unremarkable. He worked, he built. The Research Triangle project progressed through its phases with the kind of methodical momentum that Marcus brought to everything he touched. His team expanded. He hired a second associate engineer. The firm, which had always been steady, began to show the signs of an organization that was quietly becoming something more significant. A profile piece in a regional architecture and engineering publication described his work on the mixed-use development as structurally innovative in ways that only become apparent on close study, which Marcus felt was perhaps the finest professional compliment he had ever received. He did not think about Renata often. When he did, it was without the acid of bitterness. He had passed through that particular tunnel and come out the other side into something cleaner. He thought about what he was building. He thought about where the next project would take him. He thought, occasionally, about the kind of partnership, genuine, equal, grounded in actual respect, that he had not had and now understood clearly what it would need to look like. It was on a Friday evening in November, 8 months after that Tuesday morning, in March, when he had stood in his empty office, that Marcus's phone began to ring. He was at his desk, reviewing preliminary drawings for a new residential commission, and he glanced at the screen, expecting a colleague or a contractor. The name on the screen was not a colleague or a contractor. The name on the screen was Renata. He looked at it for a moment. The call ended. His phone rang again immediately. Pause. He looked at the screen again. The same name, the same number that had blocked him in every direction while she was cleaning out their accounts. And he set the phone face down on his desk and returned to his drawings for 40 seconds. Then he picked it up. He answered on the 5th call. She had called 44 times in total, beginning the moment the segment aired, and he had been watching the count climb. Marquise. Her voice was controlled, but only barely. He could hear the particular tightness that sat just beneath the surface when Renata was managing an emotion she did not want to display. He had heard that quality before. He had once spent considerable energy trying to gently work through whatever the concealed emotion was, trying to create space for her to feel safe enough to say the actual thing. He no longer felt that particular responsibility. "Renata," he said, "we need to talk," she said. "We have an attorney for that," he said. "As I believe you're aware, this isn't about the settlement." A pause. "I need you to turn on Channel 7. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I'm working, Marcus." And there was something in the way she said it, not a plea exactly, but something adjacent to it, something he had not heard from her before. "Please turn on Channel 7. He did not own a television in the conventional sense. He had a large screen in the living room that he used primarily for project presentations and, on occasion, sporting events, and he rarely turned it on in the evening. But something in her tone made him reach for the remote. The channel resolved into the mid-segment of a local news broadcast, A news anchor was speaking over footage of what appeared to be a courtroom with documents on screen. Marcus read the banner at the bottom of the screen first because he was a man who read the structural elements before the decorative ones. The banner read, Charlotte Developer Trevor Haas faces fraud charges, investors allege, Keem totaling $2.3 million. And then the secondary line beneath it in smaller text, multiple partners implicated in property investment fraud. The camera cut to file footage of Trevor Haas, a man Marcus had never met, had only heard described through the filtered accounts of mutual acquaintances. The file footage was apparently from a professional profile piece, because Trevor Haas looked prosperous and confident in it. The kind of man who wore his success loudly and expected others to be impressed by the noise. Below his footage, in a sidebar that the news program had apparently added for context, was a photograph of a woman identified as a business associate. The woman was Renata. She's listed as a person of interest, Renata said, and Marcus realized she had been speaking into the phone for several seconds while he processed what he was seeing. They're saying I signed documents. I didn't know what I was signing. Marcus, I didn't. He told me it was standard investment structuring, and I trusted him. And I did not know. Marcus watched the screen. The news anchor moved on to the next segment, but the banner remained. He turned the television off. Marcus, she said, I need your help. The silence between them lasted long enough that Marcus could hear faintly traffic from wherever she was calling from. He thought about the Tuesday morning in March. He thought about the empty office. He thought about the $67,000 he was still waiting to see repaid according to a court-ordered schedule. He thought about Carol Indigua, who had told him to let her think she won. And then he thought about something else, something that had nothing to do with strategy or patience or the accumulated ledger of wrongs. He thought about what kind of man he actually was. Tell me exactly what you signed, he said. And tell me the truth. She did. And whatever else Renata Webb had been, whatever the marriage had revealed about her character and her choices, she told him the truth. Now the full account took 23 minutes. He listened without interrupting, without editorializing, without the quiet sighs and careful diplomatic phrases that had once characterized every difficult conversation they had. He simply listened. And what emerged was the picture of a woman who had, in the process of constructing a new life with a man she had badly misjudged, been maneuvered into signing documents she did not fully understand by someone who had seen in her both access and vulnerability. Trevor Haas had been using legitimate-seeming investment vehicles as a front for collecting funds from secondary investors. Funds which were then redirected through a series of LLCs into personal accounts, while the promised returns to original investors never materialized. Renata had been named as a co-signatory on several of the documents because Trevor had represented this as a means of protecting her investment and giving her a formal stake in the ventures. She had signed without independent legal review, without understanding what the co-signatory designation actually meant, and without recognizing that her name on those documents would, in the eyes of investigators, place her in the chain of the scheme. Marcus asked 2 questions when she finished. The first was whether she had her own attorney engaged on this matter. She did not. She had called her divorce attorney, Jeffrey Carver, who had told her this was outside his practice area, and given her 2 names, which she had not yet called because she had instead, she said, called Marcus. The second question was whether she had spoken to investigators yet. She had not. Call the investigators before you call an attorney, Marcus said. Voluntarily. Do not wait for them to come to you. And when you call the attorney, use this name. He gave her the name of a criminal defense attorney, a colleague of Carol Indigua's, whom Carol had mentioned in a different context. A man who had a reputation for methodical, careful representation of clients who needed someone with genuine competence rather than theatrical aggression. Tell him, Marcus Webb referred you. Renata was quiet for a moment. Why are you helping me? Marcus considered the question. It deserved a real answer, not a deflection. Because what you did to our marriage was wrong, he said. And what happened to you after isn't the same category of thing. Helping you with this doesn't change the first part." She started to say something else, and he heard that quality in her voice again. Not the controlled tightness, but something underneath it. Something that sounded, for the first time since he had known her, like genuine humility. Like someone encountering the shape of themselves in an unfamiliar light. "You're on television because you trusted the wrong person," Marcus said. "I know something about that." He let that sit for a moment, not cruelly, but not softly either. Just precisely. "Get the attorney. Be truthful with the investigators. That's all I can tell you." He ended the call. Then he looked at his phone. In the span of that conversation, 39 additional missed calls had stacked up. She had been calling continuously from the moment the news segment began until he answered on call 5, and then calling again during the pauses while they spoke. Total count, 44. He set the phone down. He looked at his drawings. He picked up his pencil. Then he set it down again and looked at the window, at the dark street outside his house. His house, the one he had purchased and paid for and maintained and reclaimed, and he allowed himself, privately, to feel the full weight of everything that had happened and everything that had been revealed. Not triumph, not satisfaction in someone else's suffering. Something more nuanced and, he thought, more honest than either of those things. The feeling of a structure fully examined, weaknesses identified and addressed, foundation confirmed sound. The feeling of knowing, finally, exactly where things stood. The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were clear. Renata engaged the attorney Marcus had recommended, a man named Philip O'Say, who was, as advertised, methodical and precise. Philip's initial assessment was that Renata's cooperation with investigators, offered voluntarily and early, combined with the documentary evidence that the primary architecture of the scheme predated her involvement by several years, placed her in a meaningfully different legal position from Trevor Haas. She had been, in Philip's professional judgment, a secondary actor, whose culpability depended heavily on what could be established about her knowledge and intent. The voluntary cooperation was, he told her, the single most important decision she could make, and the fact that she had made it before any formal contact from investigators was a significant advantage. Trevor Haas, it emerged over the following months of investigation and prosecution, had been operating his investment scheme for approximately 4 years before Renata entered the picture. He had identified her specifically because of her professional profile and her social visibility. Her name on documents gave the venture a legitimate-seeming aesthetic that he had been deliberately cultivating. He had also, investigators found, been aware of her recent divorce and the financial settlement she was managing, and had structured his approach to her accordingly. He had, in a very specific sense, done to Renata something recognizable to anyone who had watched what Renata had done to Marcus. He had seen someone's trust as a resource to be extracted. Marcus followed these developments from a careful distance. He did not involve himself in the investigation beyond providing, at Philip O'Say's request relayed through Carol Lindigua, documentation of Renata's financial conduct during the marriage. This documentation was relevant because it established a timeline for her access to certain funds, establishing, counterintuitively, that some of the money that had passed through her hands in the investment scheme had originated from her own resources rather than from the scheme itself, which was relevant to the question of the flow of funds. Marcus provided the documents without comment and without condition. He and Renata spoke twice more during this period, both times briefly, both times through the intermediary framework of their respective attorneys. The divorce settlement repayment schedule continued. He did not accelerate it, and he did not seek to renegotiate it. The terms were what they were agreed to by a court, and Marcus had no interest in creating new leverage from a situation he had not sought. What he did do during these weeks was finish the Research Triangle project. The final phase of construction completed on a date in January, 10 months after the Tuesday morning in March, and Marcus drove out to the site on a clear winter afternoon and stood in the lobby of the completed structure, a residential and commercial mixed-use building of 14 stories. Structurally innovative in ways that would only become apparent on close study. And he stood there in the winter light and looked at what he had built. Not just the building, all of it, the methodical reconstruction of his finances. The legal process executed with patience and integrity. The practice that had grown and deepened while other things had fallen away. The capacity to help someone who had wronged him because the help was the right thing to offer, not because it balanced any ledger or reclaimed any ground. The structure of a life rebuilt from foundation up, this time with full knowledge of exactly where every load was being carried and by what. He thought about Carol Indigua's 5 words, "Let her think she won." And then he thought about what winning actually looked like, as opposed to what it felt like in the moment when you were draining an account and blocking a number and imagining that you had successfully dismantled someone's world. Winning, Marcus thought, looked like this lobby, like this January afternoon, like the complete, unambiguous knowledge of where you stood and what you had made of the ground beneath you. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a contractor on the new residential commission, calling about a material specification that needed clarification. Marcus answered, walked toward the light falling through the lobby's east-facing windows, and began explaining, clearly and precisely, exactly what he needed. There is something worth saying about what Marcus Webb's story reveals, not just as a sequence of events, but as a map of something true about how the world actually works when you are paying close attention. Renata had dismantled the visible architecture of their shared life with considerable efficiency. She had taken the money. She had taken the documents. She had taken the rendering off his wall. She had blocked every avenue of communication as a final declarative act, a kind of gesture designed to make a person feel utterly erased. And in the short term, the very short term, she had achieved exactly what she was attempting. Marcus had stood in an empty office with bare walls and empty drawers and an emptied account, but the things she could not take were the things that, in the end, determined everything. She could not take his professional reputation, which was documented and credentialed and spread across 11 years of completed projects that existed in the physical world. She could not take the premarital purchase records for the house, which were filed with the county and immune to her ambitions. She could not take the discipline and patience that were simply the way Marcus was built. She could not take the quality of attention he brought to every problem he encountered, including the problem of her. And she could not, this is perhaps the most important thing, take from him the capacity to decide. When she called him from the context of a situation she had made for herself, to answer the phone and be still the kind of person he had always been. That last part was not weakness. It was not confusion about what she had done. It was the choice of a man who had looked at his own foundation, found it sound, and decided that his values were not contingent on how others behaved. That integrity was not a performance he put on for people who deserved it. It was simply how he was structured, and he was not going to redesign himself because someone had tried to demolish him. If you are watching this tonight, and you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, somewhere in the part where the accounts are empty and the phone is blocked and the world looks like it has been successfully taken apart, I want you to hear this clearly. The people who move against you with that kind of careful, premeditated thoroughness are always operating on an assumption that will fail them. They assume that what is visible is what is real. They assume that the resources they can see and move and spend are the sum of your power. They miss the thing that cannot be transferred or drained or removed from the wall. The part of you that knows how to think. The part that knows how to wait. The part that understands the difference between a structure that looks solid and a structure that actually is. Marcus Webb rebuilt in 8 months what Renata thought it would take him years to recover from, and he did it, not by moving fast or moving loudly, but by moving correctly, one documented step at a time. one methodical decision after another, with a clarity that came, in part, from having nothing left to protect except the truth. 44 calls. 8 months. That is not just a number. That is the full rotation of a reversal, the complete arc from dismissal to reckoning, from blocked number to desperate redealing, from the assumption of victory to the reality of consequence. And through all 44 of those calls, Marcus did not answer. Immediately, he let the phone ring. He looked at his drawings. He thought about what kind of man he was. And then he answered, and was exactly that. Man, no more and no less. And that, more than any court order, more than any financial settlement, more than any restructured repayment plan, is what it means to actually win. If this story moved you, if it made you think about something in your own life or someone you know who is carrying the weight of a situation they did not choose, leave a comment below. Tell me whether you think Marcus made the right choice in answering that 44th call. Tell me whether you would have done the same. These are questions worth sitting with, because how we answer them says something real about what we believe justice is actually for. Like this video if it reached you. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next story comes, because there are more of them and they are waiting. Thank you for being here tonight. Take care of your foundations. Everything else follows from there.